Chapter 13, Nervous System, Brain, and Cranial Nerves, Part 2. So, wrapped up last time talking about how the fourth ventricle connects to both the subarachnoid space, thereby sending cerebral spinal fluid out to surround the brain and spinal cord, and it also merges with the central canal, a space within the spinal cord itself. The cerebrospinal fluid has many functions. One very important one is buoyancy. It basically reduces the apparent weight of the brain and spinal cord and prevents the brain from resting on the cranial bones, and prevents the brain also from, through gravity's pull, get pushed through the foramen magnum into the vertebral cavity or vertebral canal. Protection. The cerebrospinal fluid provides a liquid cushion that surrounds the brain and spinal cord so that if you do have a jarring motion or an impact, it will reduce the force on the brain itself. And then environmental stability. It provides nutrients and chemical messengers for the brain, so it bathes it in nutrients, and it also helps to remove waste products. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid is produced by structures called the choroid plexuses. There is a choroid plexus in each of the four ventricles, and they are specialized tissues composed of epidermal cells, that neuroglial cell, glial cell, epidermal cells, and blood capillaries. So the epidermal cells surround blood capillaries and then pull the fluid that forms the cerebral spinal fluid out of the bloodstream and into the ventricles. The produced fluid then circulates and travels through the ventricles, so from the lateral ventricles into the third. This is where the third ventricle is. From the third ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth, and then from the fourth ventricle out to the subarachnoid space around the brain and spinal cord, as well as the central canal of the spinal cord. And we end up with basically a one-way flow of the cerebrospinal fluid. When the cerebrospinal fluid reaches the more superior areas of the cerebrum, there are structures called arachnoidvilli that remove the excess cerebrospinal fluid. So basically, the cerebrospinal fluid is here in the subarachnoid space, and then when it comes up and reaches an arachnoid villus, this little finger-like projection pushes into a dural venous sinus, and then the fluid of the cerebrospinal fluid can exit and enter the bloodstream. So it's a one-way flow that returns the cerebrospinal fluid back to the bloodstream. Hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus is a rather severe condition in which the cerebrospinal fluid is unable to be removed appropriately, so that the person ends up with excessive cerebral spinal fluid within the cranial cavity. Often this is caused by some sort of blockage that prevents the removal. This can have severe consequences. If the child is young enough, like an infant, then their skull isn't fully formed and may be able to withstand some of the pressure caused by the excess of cerebral spinal fluid, and leads to a enlarged skull, as it were. This condition needs to be treated quickly. If the person is an adult, have to do it even faster because there's no ability for the cranium to expand. And the way they correct it is surgically. They implant a shunt from the head down into usually the trunk of the body to drain off the excessive cerebral spinal fluid. All right, we mentioned this before, but there is a blood-brain barrier. This helps to regulate what can enter the brain's interstitial fluid, the fluids surrounding the brain tissue. As we know, it's formed by astrocytes surrounding blood capillaries, and it prevents pathogens from entering the brain. It prevents many drugs, not all, but many drugs from getting into the brain. Helps to prevent waste from the bloodstream from entering the brain, and it helps to control the levels of normal substances that the brain wants at certain levels: hormones, ions, electrolytes, nutrients, and so forth. So again, we have the astrocytes, which are the gatekeepers, and they wrap around the blood capillaries. And so you end up with two layers of thin cellular structures, the perivascular feet of the astrocytes and the endothelial cells of the capillaries. And the capillaries themselves have actually reduced their own permeability by forming tight junctions between neighboring cells. So the blood capillaries found in the brain are actually less permeable than in other parts of the body. Now, this barrier is not absolute. Some things can get through no matter what, especially lipid-soluble compounds. They're able to pass through the plasma membranes of the cells and into the brain tissue. This can include things like nicotine, alcohol, some anesthetics. And there are also a few places in the brain where the blood capillaries are not protected by the blood-brain barrier. This includes the choroid plexuses. Instead of astrocytes, we know it's the epidermal cells that are surrounding the blood capillaries in order to produce cerebrospinal fluid. And then also around the hypothalamus and the pineal gland, those structures produce hormones, and so they need easy access to the bloodstream to deposit the hormones into the bloodstream. All right, finally, moving on to official brain structures. We've got the cerebrum. Again, cerebrum, largest portion of the brain, most superior portion. It has a left and right hemispheres separated by that longitudinal fissure. And it is viewed to be the center of intelligence and judgment and reasoning. Our memory is localized all throughout the cerebrum. Our voluntary motor functions for controlling skeletal muscles are localized here, and also many sensory activities end up in the cerebrum. So again, if you do a coronal section of the cerebrum, again, you can see the left and right hemispheres, you can see the longitudinal fissure, you can see the inner white matter, the outer cerebral cortex, the cerebral nuclei. There's this structure here, which is the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres to each other. The cerebrum has a lot of important functions. However, it's hard to say this specific spot is where the functions are because a lot of the various functions overlap and have indistinct barriers, so that basically the brain doesn't say this is just the spot for one thing. It all kind of fuzzes and overlaps and varies a little from person to person. Although there are certain sites where we know if injury to the brain occurs there, it will have certain effects to the function of the brain. For instance, one complicated function is memory. It turns out memory is scattered all throughout the cerebrum. Our memories are stored all throughout the cerebrum. It's also worth noting that there's an innervation flip. This basically means that the right cerebral hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and the left cerebral hemisphere controls the right side of the body. We also have cerebral lateralization. This means that the two hemispheres are not identical. They both have structural and functional differences, primarily in higher order functioning. For instance, the brain regions responsible for speech are usually found in the left cerebral hemisphere. As we mentioned earlier, there are 5 cerebral lobes. We have the frontal lobe. Underneath the frontal bone, it ends at the central sulcus. So the central sulcus is a sulcus structure that separates the frontal lobe from the rest of the cerebrum. It also ends with the lateral sulcus inferiorly, separating it from the rest of the brain, or the rest of the cerebrum. And its functions include voluntary motor control, so for controlling skeletal muscles consciously. It has functions involving concentration and verbal communication, decision-making, planning, personality. A lot of those higher reasoning functions are localized to the frontal lobe. We have the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe terminates at the central sulcus. It is protected partly by the parietal bones, and its primarily concerned with general sensory functions. These are the functions associated with the skin and muscles. Includes things like touch, itch, tickle, thermal sensation of the skin. And through regions of the parietal lobe, we can do things like evaluate the shape and texture of objects, even without seeing them. Temporal lobe is inferior to the lateral sulcus and is obviously on the lateral sides, and it is involved in hearing and smell. Then we have the occipital lobe, the posterior lobe. It is protected partially by the occipital bone, and it's primarily responsible for visual information and also storing visual memories. And then the fifth lobe, the insula, you can only see if you cut open the brain. So here is the insula in orange, and it is deep in the lateral sulcus. So here is the lateral sulcus, here is the insula, and it's involved in taste sensations, interpreting taste sensations, and it is one of the many structures associated with memory. To be honest, all the lobes have some association with memory. All right, when we look at where particular functions are somewhat localized in the brain, we see that the motor functions tend toward more the anterior side of the brain, especially with the frontal lobe, and the sensory areas are more in the posterior part of the brain, in the other four lobes. And then there are also what are called associated areas, and associated areas basically are using the information coming from the sensory areas or processing information before it goes to the motor control in the frontal lobe. And we will, of course, go over all of these. So, sensory areas. We have the primary somatosensory cortex. Primary somatosensory cortex is a long structure also known as the postcentral gyrus that is directly adjacent or posterior to the central sulcus. It is part of the parietal lobe, and it is where all of our somatic sensory information arrives. When it reaches this location in the cerebrum, that's when we officially clearly become aware of these sensations. And these sensations are coming from all over the body. So proprioceptors for position and stretch on muscles, touch sensation, pressure, pain, temperature receptors. Basically, sensations from the skin and muscles are going to the primary somatosensory cortex. Here you can see it again. Now, when scientists have studied the primary somatosensory cortex, they discovered that there is what they call a sensory homocylous, basically a map of the person's body localized to different areas of the primary somatosensory cortex. And each area is larger or smaller depending on how much sensory information is collected from those areas of the body. So for instance, the leg, the knee, the elbow do not get a large area on the primary somatosensory cortex, but more sensuous areas like the hands, the face and lips, the tongue, they command larger regions because they possess many, many more sensory receptors and have many, many more sensory nerves carrying information from them. All right, then we have the primary visual cortex or primary visual area that is found on the occipital lobe. Whoops. That is processing and receiving incoming visual information from the eyes. Kind of weird. The eyes are in the front or anterior side of the head. The primary visual cortex is in the posterior side of the brain. The primary auditory cortex is localized to the temporal lobe, again receiving and processing auditory information from the ears. We have the primary olfactory cortex, which is also part of the temporal lobe, and that is for consciousness and awareness of smells. And then the primary gustatory cortex is part of the insula for processing taste sensations. And that's where we'll stop with this part of the lecture.